Hello everyone, my name is Raquel Fox, and my research project examined the Sauk and Meskwaki nations during and after the American Revolution. My research focused on how these indigenous nations navigated imperial conflict, protected trade networks, and attempted to preserve sovereignty in the upper Mississippi Valley during a period of major political transformation in North America. Rather than treating Native nations as secondary participants in revolutionary history, my project argues that the Sauk and Meskwaki were active geopolitical actors whose diplomacy and territorial strategies shaped the Western frontier throughout the Revolutionary era and beyond. Traditional narratives of the American Revolution often focus primarily on the Eastern colonies and the military struggle between the Patriots and Britain. However, modern historians increasingly argue that the Revolution must also be understood as a continental conflict involving Native nations, imperial powers, trade systems, and struggles over land and sovereignty. For the Sauk and Meskwaki, the Revolution disrupted existing diplomatic relationships and economic systems throughout the Mississippi River corridor. These nations were not isolated from imperial politics. Instead, they became deeply involved in negotiations and alliances that shaped power throughout the western interior of North America. One of the central findings of my research involved indigenous trade systems along the Mississippi River. The Sauk and Meskwaki occupied strategically important territory connected to major waterways linking the Great Lakes, the Illinois country, and the Mississippi Valley. Trade was not simply economic. Trade networks shaped diplomacy, military alliances, kinship systems, and regional influence. European empires depended heavily on native trade relationships, which gave indigenous nations significant political leverage during periods of imperial conflict. My research argues that the Sauk and Meskwaki used these trade systems strategically to preserve autonomy and maintain influence during the Revolutionary era. Another major theme of my project was indigenous diplomacy and geopolitical strategy. The Sauk and Meskwaki were not passive victims of colonial expansion. Instead, they actively negotiated with British, Spanish, French, and later American officials in order to protect their lands and economic interests. Many indigenous leaders viewed American westward expansion as a more immediate long-term threat than British imperial rule. This perspective challenges traditional patriotic interpretations of the Revolution and demonstrates that Native nations often understood the conflict very differently than American colonists. The historiography surrounding Native Americans during the Revolution has evolved significantly over time. Earlier historians often portrayed indigenous peoples as obstacles to American settlement or treated them as peripheral to revolutionary history. More recent historians instead emphasize indigenous agency, diplomacy, and political influence. Historian Ned Blackhawk argues that Native history is foundational to understanding American history itself. Similarly, Richard White describes the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley as middle ground, shaped by negotiation and intercultural community and diplomacy. More recent scholarship by John Ryan Fisher demonstrates how the Sauk and Meskwaki used the Mississippi River as a geopolitical center to preserve sovereignty and maintain regional influence. My research also incorporated the work of historian Eric Steven Zimmer, whose dissertation, Red Earth Nation, emphasizes long-term Meskwaki sovereignty and environmental identity. Zimmer argues that Meskwaki political identity remained deeply connected to land, environmental stewardship, and territorial continuity long after the Revolutionary era. His work highlights valuable primary sources, including treaty negotiations, Indian agency records, territorial correspondence, and oral histories that preserve indigenous perspectives often overlooked in traditional revolutionary narratives. This scholarship demonstrates the consequences of the Revolution extended far beyond 1783 and continued shaping Native communities throughout the 19th century. This 1840 map of the half-breed Sauk and Fox Reservation visually demonstrates the continued relationship between the Sauk, Meskwaki, and the Mississippi River landscape long after the American Revolution. The map reflects more than territorial boundaries. It illustrates how Indigenous land, identity, and sovereignty remain deeply connected despite increasing American settlement and territorial expansion. At the same time, the highly surveyed grid system visible on the map symbolizes the growing imposition of American political and territorial organization into Native lands. This primary source reinforces one of the major arguments of my research, that the consequences of the American Revolution for Native nations did not end in 1783. Instead, Indigenous communities continued navigating pressures related to land loss, territorial restructuring, and sovereignty well into the 19th century. Although Native nations participated throughout the Revolution as independent political powers, the Treaty of Paris in 1783 ignored Indigenous sovereignty entirely. Britain transferred massive territories to the United States without Native consent, despite Native occupation and defense of those lands. For the Sauk and Meskwaki, this accelerated American settlement, territorial pressure, and future conflicts over sovereignty in the Mississippi Valley. The Revolution therefore became a turning point in the struggle over Indigenous land, diplomacy, and political autonomy. Overall, my research demonstrated that the American Revolution cannot fully be understood without including Native nations such as the Sauk and Meskwaki. The Revolution was not simply a war between Britain and the colonies. It was also a struggle over trade, diplomacy, sovereignty, and control of the North American interior. By centering Indigenous perspectives and geopolitical strategy, this project reframes the Revolution as a continental conflict whose consequences reshaped Native communities for generations.